Welcome to the Crazy Might Work podcast, where we celebrate authors, entrepreneurs, innovators, inventors, and scientists who live at the very frontiers of human consciousness and possibility. We discuss their moments of breakthrough and analyze the strategies they use to enhance their own thinking and challenge conventional wisdom. So good morning, everyone. My guest this morning combines her background in biomimicry and communications to serve as a connective tissue between humans and the natural world. She leads the communication strategy at the Institute of Biomimicry. She has a Master of Science in Biomimicry from Arizona State, as well as a bachelor's degree in journalism from Georgia State University. She works with media organizations, brands, and influencers to enhance advocacy and engagement for nature-inspired design. Please join me in welcoming the Communications Director at the Biomimicry Institute, Lex Amore. Welcome, Lex.
Thank you for having me. It's so great to be connecting with you and the audience here today.
Likewise, and you're coming at us from Hawaii, which I imagine is the place to be from a biomimicry perspective. I'm sure there must be plenty of inspiration outside your front door.
Yes, I am very grateful for being able to come from the land of the Kanaka Oiwi people. And here it's a very fascinating biodiversity because we're a much younger island. And so compared to somewhere like Costa Rica, being out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with being formed from lava, the organisms here that are at least native are fascinating. It's just, on Maui itself, there's every climate except the Arctic. So it's a really very neat place to be.
Yeah, I know that that NASA had one of their analogs somewhere in Hawaii, which kind of suggests that it's also a bit like Mars or the moon or something. So I think it's got everything that you need.
Yes, there's the summit of Haleakala. It's the volcano that's dormant here. It literally looks like Mars. When you get down in the summit, it is fascinating.
You'll notice, Lex, that I've dressed up as a kind of a giant orchid in your honor. Celebrate biomimicry, and
love it.
I'm not too sure what message it's telling us about nature, but we'll figure it out. So Lex, it's probably worth just pausing for a moment to go, what are we talking about, right? We get lots of blank stares when we use the word biomimicry. It's still, I think, a fairly new concept to many. So could you indulge us and just give us your take on what it is and what it all means?
Absolutely. I do get the bio what, and then nothing that I say after is heard. So I love explaining because it seems complex, but at the end, I always get the resounding, oh, well, that just makes sense. So biomimicry is innovation inspired by nature. So really what we're doing here is nature has these amazing strategies that have evolved over as long as Earth has been around, the millions of years that have the evolution for the organisms alive today. They hold secrets to how to live on this earth, not just sustainably, but actually regeneratively. And so what we do in biomimicry is we study those kinds of strategies and ask how we can apply them to our human design so that we can also create conditions conducive to life, just like nature does. So it's both a scientific methodology, but there's also a philosophy behind it, because part of it is coming back to this idea that we are part of the natural world and we can design the way that we live and function in it as if we are natural organisms, just like the nature that surrounds us.
Love it. So, and just thinking about application of it, it sounds kind of mysterious, Lex, and I know that there's some real science behind this, and I know you've done your masters in biomimicry through Arizona, so it's clearly an emerging discipline and science, and so I appreciate that there's probably a lot going on behind that in terms of how do we get there? Is there a codified systemic way that we can actually study nature or study the right examples in nature to inform our thinking? And I'd love just to hear your thoughts on process. If you were trying to solve for something, how would you engage with it and use biomimicry to suggest some of the answers?
That's such a great question, because putting this in practice is obviously where we actually get to see real change happen. So there's actually two approaches when you're looking at formal biomimicry. You can have this organism that you've learned from or that you studied, or sitting out in the natural world and saying, for example, how does an owl fly? And using the specific form of the feathers and then trying to match that to a problem that you might already be working with. But the more traditional approach to actually applying biomimicry is that you first have a problem that you want to solve. And so there's actually a few different schools of thought for this particular thinking. I was trained through the biomimicry thinking process, and there's a slight variation that we use at the Institute called the design spiral, but it's very similar. Basically, what you do is you define the problem. You get really clear about the context, and most design applications do this already, but the difference is you're really trying to hone in on what is that functional problem that you're really looking for. So for example, if you're in a warm place and you have a building that you need to keep people comfortable and it's really hot, you're not going to say, well, how do we create air conditioning? Because that's not really a functional problem. You want to dig a little deeper. It's actually how do you cool? And so that when you're able to get really clear about that function, then you go to the biologize. This is part of the design spiral. And really what that means is it's a fun way of saying that you're reframing that function to be able to ask nature for that solution. So how does nature cool could easily go into, we have a database called asknature.org, and that gives you basically all these different functional strategies where you can learn how nature does these cool things. And so from there, that's part of that discovery process. You're getting a matrix of research solutions where it could be all different kinds of climates and organisms of how nature cools. Everything from the Saharan silver ant because of the hairs on the head to termite mounds and the way that there's able to have passive ventilation. So you start curating these kinds of research, and from there you actually abstract that design principle. So basically what you're doing is you're going from what biology does, how does that termite mound use the passive cooling system, and you translate that back into design so an engineer can use it. And this part is really important because one of the things that we don't want is that everyone gets scared if they're not a biologist. You don't actually need to be a biologist. I have a master's of science, but I don't actually have formal science background training. My background is in communications. So I know how to ask the right kinds of questions. And that's why I try and educate other people about this kind of problem thinking process. So once you've abstracted that design principle, you have something that you can then work with. And then you go to the emulate stage, which is basically you're going to create something. You're going to work with your design team. It's a lot of iteration, testing, being able to see how is this really solving that initial problem that you were hoping to serve. And then from there, really, really importantly, you evaluate how well is this not just meeting the performance needs, but also some of these aspirational ideals for sustainability. How well is it matching nature's idea of performing this function? And so it's a spiral because you're going to go back and forth to different processes throughout, but really it gives you an approach to say, almost any problem you can think of, nature probably has a really cool strategy that you could apply to the human design.
I really want to come back to some of those other really cool examples and also those design principles that nature uses. And I think that's just fascinating. But I wanted to just for a moment back up a little and just really intrigued in your own backstory and how you got into, how did you discover biomimicry and then commit to doing a master's in that field?
I've talked about this a couple times because it's my favorite story. So I love that you're asking this because everyone has their own unique story. And for me, it starts with deep grief, climate grief, despair, hopelessness. I had only learned about climate change when it was about a little over a decade ago. So I was in my early 20s and I had no idea that what was happening in the world. And when I learned, I couldn't do anything but absorb information and try to figure out. I went and trained with the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. I changed my job so that I would only be serving sustainability clients. I spent years reading as many books, understanding the science, and it blew my mind to know that this was a thing that people knew about for decades and no one was doing anything. It's like, how is not everyone panicking right now? The earth is on fire. And all I wanted was to change the world. And then ultimately I fell deep into this despair where, yes, I'm working with the sustainability clients that are doing amazing work, but I felt like I wasn't doing enough. And of course, just at the right time, I came across a talk from Dana Baumeister, and she was talking about mimicking life in a way that basically all the solutions to our grandest challenges are all around us because history is on their side. There's these time-tested solutions, this R&D that's been happening so much longer than our young species has been around. And for the first time, I felt like I breathed fresh air in years. I felt hope. That feeling of just thinking, okay, so we can look at the context right now and then solve for the challenges that are around us. And that gave me the difference between being paralyzed by fear to action, mobilizing myself to say, okay, now I want to absorb this kind of approach. And so within a few months, I enrolled in the master's program, and I actually got to study directly under Dana. I was a teaching assistant for her for a few semesters, and it radically transformed my way of perceiving the world. And then after a couple of years, I learned about the Biomimicry Institute needing some communication support. So it was the best way for me to merge both of my found expertise, where I could help people learn about biomimicry and apply it, but then also communicate these values in ways that, like right now, I'm working with startups that are using this kind of a practice. And these are people that are founders at the head that are working with communications. They don't know anything about this kind of stuff, or not most of them. And so how can they better pull out the science and take out the jargon that loses a lot of people so that they can understand that efficiency? And here I am today, being able to actually feel hope because I see so many people around the world paying attention and using these kinds of approaches to solve real problems.
I think there's so much in an approach that increases energy, and gives people hope that because that in a sense is self-sustaining, right? If it's draining and demanding in an exhausting kind of way, then that it has a limited kind of lifespan. Whereas I feel this really obviously has energized you and given you hope that we can do something different.
Yes.
Just thinking about it kind of beyond your personal experience and thinking about some of the big systemic challenges that we've got in the world, it seems to me that this is a really promising approach for some of those big, whether it's social, environmental challenges. Are you seeing evidence of that, Lex? I mean, are you starting to see organizations working together using this kind of thinking in any context?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many examples out there in the world. The system level is something that I think has only recently been, and I say recent in the last year or so, really getting more attention and focus, because form for a while took that kind of the focus. But for system level biomimicry, are really looking at nature applied practices. Like, it's coming back to recognizing that I think people are starting to understand their effect on the world around them, that they actually have an influence, and you can't create a building without understanding what land it's going to be on and how the resources are all going to be affected. And so some of the bigger questions are being asked of what would happen if a building functioned like a tree, or a city functioned like a forest, and trying to use that kind of collaboration and that insight to start thinking about these full intended consequences that come out of a result of all of our actions. One of the bigger projects that we've worked on is, it started with a question of what would happen if the fashion industry functioned like an ecosystem? Because we know that there's a lot of issues with fashion, not just on use and how trends and styles and just the excess amount, but also just in the production and what happens at the end of use of a garment when you think that it goes to Goodwill, but it actually just ends up in the back often and then shipped to somewhere like Chile, where it just ends up in a landfill. And then there's havoc that's wreaked on all kinds of effects on that ecosystem. And so we worked on this report that really dove in deep of saying what's missing here. And what was found from that was there is nature disperses and nature decomposes. And these are two missing elements from, I would say, yes, the fashion industry, but most industries aren't thinking about decomposition as part of this process. And what came out of it was a pilot program, and it's called Design for Decomposition. And it's working with the fashion industry to try and actually make this scale. So how can we actually degrade and decompose the existing waste that's piled up, but also how can we design for decomposition in the beginning so we don't have to worry about the excess waste? And these are big questions that require a lot of people to be not just on board, but to be influencers and actually being catalysts to make this happen. And so it's challenging and it's a long term, but the conversations are coming. And I'm seeing things like organizational structures, asking nature how to collaborate, communicate. How does nature process information, sense signals, or have these kinds of feedback loops? And there's the functional strategy, yes, that we can find these efficient strategies for how people can work better together, how organizations can function better, and then also, of course, how we're designing our cities and everything in between. But there's also this call I'm seeing for action for the human need to reconnect with the natural world and to each other. And that can't be understated because it really, when it comes down to the individual, when someone has hope and isn't paralyzed by fear and they know how to ask the right kinds of questions, it then changes the whole system from the bottom up. And I'm loving seeing that shift and the science that's coming out behind, forest bathing and these things that may not seem connected, but it all is all deeply connected, because once you find that hope in the natural world and you find yourself in it, and you start to pay attention to the decisions that you're making that may not have a positive impact on it.
Just listening to you talk, it sounds like there are a lot of connections between biomimicry and systems thinking. Is that, do you think that's true?
Absolutely. And I really see a lot of alignment too with things like environmental and social justice. Like this is all very deeply interconnected because the concept of biomimicry is recognizing that we are interconnected. And so when you're able to shift that perspective, both on the personal and organizational level, the outcome is amazing, because it really starts to consider these things that we've worked in silo for so long. And then there's also this idea where it's a whole system shift of the way that people are seeing each other. And in places like where I am in the United States, yes, you're seeing a lot of divisiveness between people and their values, but also you're seeing a lot more voices of why we're not trying to put weakness associated with kindness anymore, that you're actually starting to care a little bit more in ways that it does have an outcome on oneself. And I think there was a lot of movement around this in the initial sustainability stages where everyone kept talking about, like, what are your grandchildren going to have at this time? If you don't do something, what are you going to be leaving behind? And a lot of people didn't see themselves in that. And so now we're seeing the effects of it, and it's happening right in front of each other. And unfortunately, a lot of times it does take that natural disaster, that terrible thing to happen in your neighborhood community to pay attention. But because the good thing that came out of the adaptations from the Industrial Revolution is that we have a technology where you're in Australia and I'm in Hawaii. Like, we're so far away. We get to talk about these amazing things. And so information has never been more accessible than it has been before. So there's more tools to be able to reach the people that want to do something and also make people just feel less alone in all of this.
Just elaborating a little on that connectedness aspect. Lex. You and going back to this idea of systems that in our respective societies, there's a strong kind of thread around individualism, and so some of us think of ourselves purely in those terms and struggle to see the connectedness even into society, you know, as a collective. But at a fundamental level, we are a system, aren't we, as human beings? And I heard you speaking on this just recently, but I'd love you just to elaborate on that. How is a human a system? And you know, what is that insight does that give us into how we need to interact?
I love talking about this because it really is. It's so complex when you start to think about the scale of evolution and where we're at. It can be both daunting and fascinating. And so on a very molecular level, we're made up of billions of cells, sure, but we're actually more microbe than we are human cells. And so we are not just a lot of people have been talking about like the microbiome these days and how you have all of these little creatures inside of you that can do everything from regulating your mood to, of course, building muscle and all these things that you're not really feeding your body. You're actually feeding all these little microbes inside you, which to some, I know that they're cringing right now, but it's okay because this is just natural. This is coming back to looking at how a similar approach to thinking about it is I asked a lot of people if they're a designer, and most people immediately say no. But the thing is we are all designers. We design the food that we eat that's feeding the system. We design the way that we're going to pick out clothes, how we're going to live our lives, how we're going to wake up, what we're going to eat, how the whole thing, everything that you're doing is a reality. Now, at the same time, it would be remiss for me to not state that at some level, there's some of us that have a lot of privilege and some of us that are stuck in systems that how can we possibly ask people to think about buying organic or supporting regenerative farming or any of these things when they're just struggling to put food on the table or keep a roof over their head for their families. So there's a level of recognizing that we can't just decide that we're going to change our minds always and choose some of these more sustainable practices. But what we can do is start to educate our youth to say that you are an animal, you're a natural being, and everything that they have going on is complex and part of something bigger. And that, I think, can offer some awe and inspiration and deeper connectedness. So, you know, how can they start to connect with the natural world in an urban environment? If it's not a green park, you know, can they find that apple and tell the story? Can you start to look at your own bodies and see these creatures that are just magnificent, that somehow are so resilient that you're able to breathe without thinking about it? These are things that we don't often pause to just think about how incredible it is. And this is all possible because of it's a system that's working together. You learn about the digestive system, you learn about your immune system, all these things when you're growing up, but then to put it all together, to have this being that's just walking around the earth, it's incredible. And then you recognize that you're also part of your little neighborhood system. And then you're part of the bigger community system. You're part of a country system. And then you're part of this ecosystem that is so much bigger than we can think about because it's massive and it's hard for the brain to fathom. But Earth is our home. And there's some serious healing that can happen when you just come back to recognizing that it's all connected. There's a company called Sudoc that is looking at how our livers have these enzymes that detoxify the body. And they started to recognize that the cleaning industry, there's so many chemicals that go in from detergents to actual like spray cleaner. And what ends up happening is that gets into our waterways, it gets into our soils, it gets into the air, and ultimately it gets into the food that we're eating that we're then putting in our bodies. We're going to end up having hundreds of chemicals in our body that are not natural. So they mimicked that process of how the liver detoxifies to create a chemical solution that we can use for cleaning products that don't have all the unnecessary chemicals chemicals that are going to end up disrupting hormonal regulation and all these things. So it's inspiring to see that kind of level of emulation and thinking about how we can bring it all together. But it really starts with that human body and understanding that you are a system that's functioning right now.
Lex, fascinating topic, and I want to just come back to some more of those examples because they're absolutely intriguing. But just thinking about the history of biomimicry, and I'm thinking, even before it was called biomimicry, you've got this amazing pedigree. All these stories about the Da Vinci's and the Darwins and the Newtons all drawing inspiration from nature. And I just wonder what it is about nature that makes it such a good teacher, such a great source of insight. Any thoughts on that? What's your personal sense of what it is that makes it so inspiring?
I would say it comes down to the fact that we're a very young species. And I know that it's hard not to be upset about some of the results from the Industrial Revolution. But I look at it like we didn't know better and we were just doing the best that we could. And it was some incredible strategies and inventions have come out since then and through that time. And now we know better and we can do something about cleaning up the mess that we've created. But this practice of looking to nature, this has been used as long as humans have been around because that is what we were born into. That's our natural origins. That's the reason why Janine Benyus popularized the term biomimicry in the late 90s and wrote the book Biomimicry Innovation Inspired by Nature was because she saw that opportunity to actually bring it into the academic and science community and be able to use it as a practice that's formulaic. But it's something that Indigenous peoples for a long time have been doing despite the Industrial Revolution. And so part of it is just, it's natural for us to look to the natural world in coming home and realizing how to fit in here. But at the same time, I look outside because there's so many strategies that are all around us that can be easily converted into other design problems that we have. So if you're looking at a tree's infrastructure, for example, how does it that a tree can withstand a hurricane, but one of our houses gets toppled? And what if that's actually able to be used in the design of other infrastructure? That's not even just buildings, but other durable materials. There's other applications that these strategies, which is why the abstraction process is so important, because you can take this really brilliant strategy from nature, this mechanism that works in that form, and then translate it for other application ideas, something that could, be resilient for an airplane that makes the materials lighter and more cost effective and using less of it in general, could also be applied to a plane. But when you're thinking about nature, you're going to start way back and say, like, how does nature manage materials? How does nature reduce weight? And you're looking at these different kinds of functional qualities that you might find from a tiny little beetle that's going to be used for an airplane. And so it's a fascinating approach to looking at these really creative ideas. And something that I love that Janine says is, when you quiet your human cleverness, and that's the place that we start, is humans have created these amazing ingenious solutions, but nature has some secrets that we can learn from. And it starts by just maybe slowing down and quieting what we think is going to be the solution so that we can hear new ones. And at the same time, we are also animals. So there's a wonderful gratitude offering to learn from ourselves and what we also have created. But that question comes back to, how well is this creating conditions conducive to life? Am I commandeering an ecosystem by building this thing? Am I putting this other organism that is integral to how this ecosystem functions? Am I compromising their survival? These are all things that we ask because we're knowledgeable to ask that. And a tree doesn't need to ask that because they don't do the things that humans do. And so we can learn from all these different organisms. And I think it's part of it is the solutions available, but another part is just the very fascinating, awe-inspiring approach that comes to that reintegration, that feeling that you get when you're in a meadow. Like it's all very much combined.